I'll never forget the moment I saw the little girl's face. Her big, frightened eyes stared at the table where the food had been set, and her trembling hand pointed towards something no one else seemed to notice. "Snake," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music and laughter. At first, I thought she was imagining things. After all, it was just a regular party, a celebration for Mrs. Bellow's 60th birthday. People were eating jollof rice and fried chicken, sipping on drinks, and sharing jokes. But then I saw it too, a dark, slithering shadow weaving between the plates of rice and soup. It moved like smoke, silent and fluid, curling around the dishes before sliding toward Mr. Ovie, the man everyone called the life of the party. The shadow disappeared under his agbada as if it had been summoned. Nobody else noticed. They just kept eating, laughing, clinking glasses, completely unaware of what had just happened. Mr. Ovie wasn't just a guest at these gatherings, he was a fixture. Everyone looked forward to his arrival because he brought energy, laughter, and a touch of extravagance. With his booming laugh, brightly colored agbadas, and a seemingly endless supply of crisp naira notes, he was a man people admired. He had a way of making you feel special, even if you barely knew him. "Oh, my friend," he'd call out, clapping people on the back, his voice warm and reassuring. At weddings, naming ceremonies, and birthdays, he was always there, giving generously and dancing like joy itself lived in his bones. I first met him at a wedding, where he bought drinks for the entire hall, danced with every willing partner, and showered the bride and groom with enough money to make jaws drop. A good man, they said. God has blessed him. But at Mrs. Bellow's 60th birthday party, something felt off. Mrs. Bellow's birthday was the kind of event that brought the whole community together. The open compound was decorated with colorful ribbons and balloons. The smell of fried meat, jollof rice, and pepper soup filled the air, while high-life music played from speakers that hummed with static. It was my aunt who dragged me along, saying it would be fun. I didn't mind much, I'd always liked Mrs. Bellow, and there would be plenty of food. My younger cousins came too, their laughter ringing out as they chased each other around the compound. Mr. Ovie arrived like a king, his agbada swaying as he greeted everyone with his signature enthusiasm. "Oh, Mrs. Bellow, 60 looks good on you," he declared, embracing the celebrant like she was family. He moved between tables, ensuring everyone was fed and happy, laughing loudly, filling plates, and cracking jokes that left people in stitches. But there was something about his eyes that made me pause. They were too sharp, too deliberate, scanning the crowd as though he was searching for something or someone. The girl's name was Annie. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, a tiny thing with big, curious eyes and a penchant for minding her own business. Her mother, Sister Damalola, was one of the prayer warriors at church, a woman who could outpray an entire congregation and still find time to supervise children's Sunday school. When Annie froze in her seat that evening at Mrs. Bellow's birthday party, everyone thought it was just her being a shy kid. She had been quietly picking at her plate of rice and fried plantain when her face suddenly stiffened, her fork hovering midair like she'd been paused by some invisible remote control. "What is it, Annie?" her mother asked, wiping her mouth with a napkin. Annie didn't speak at first. Instead, she raised a trembling finger, pointing directly at the table of food. "It's there," she whispered. "What's there?" I asked, leaning closer. She hesitated, her small fingers gripping the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Finally, she said, "The snake. It's inside him now." I followed Annie's gaze to where Mr. Ovie stood, his arms thrown around two elders as he guffawed loudly at some joke he'd just cracked. He looked like his usual self, tall, robust, and draped in a shimmering white agbada that looked like it had been ironed with holy water. But Annie's words lingered. "The snake. It's inside him now." I squinted, trying to see what she saw. Nothing. Mr. Ovie was just laughing, his agboda swishing as he gestured with his hands. Yet, the more I looked, the more uneasy I felt. Are you sure? I whispered to her. Yes, she said firmly. It was on the table, but now it's inside him. I decided to tell Sister Damalola. Your daughter says she saw something, I began cautiously. Sister Damalola raised an eyebrow at me. What kind of something? A snake, I said, lowering my voice. She says it went into Mr. Ovie. Sister Damalola's reaction was swift. Snake ko. Annie, what kind of snake are you talking about? Annie nodded solemnly, her eyes darting nervously between her mother and the food table. It was big. Black. It went under his agboda. Under his agboda. Sister Damalola echoed, half laughing. Oh. Are you sure you didn't eat too much jollof rice and start dreaming? A couple of people nearby overheard and chuckled. Someone muttered, children and their imaginations. Annie's face fell, but she didn't argue. I could see her shrinking under the weight of disbelief. I, however, couldn't let it go. Something about Mr. Ovie had felt off from the moment he arrived. He'd been unusually attentive to the food table, hovering over it like a hawk watching prey. Whenever someone left their plate unfinished, he'd swoop in, smiling and clearing it away himself. Oh, Mr. Ovie is too kind, one woman had said, laughing as he picked up her plate. Service to the community, he'd replied with a grin, but I'd noticed the flicker of something in his eyes. Now, armed with Annie's unsettling observation, I couldn't stop watching him. Every time he laughed or moved, I imagined a snake slithering just beneath his agboda, waiting for its next victim. Things took a turn when Mrs. Bellow's cousin, Uncle Femi, decided to take matters into his own hands. Uncle Femi was a known troublemaker, a self-appointed detective with a fondness for conspiracies. I heard the girl say there's a snake, he declared, marching toward the food table with a rolled-up newspaper in hand. Uncle Femi, please, someone tried to stop him, but it was too late. He started lifting tablecloths, picking under chairs, and banging the floor with his stick, shouting, "Where's the snake? I will kill it today." The party dissolved into chaos. Women screamed, chairs toppled over, and children clung to their mothers as Uncle Femi continued his dramatic investigation. Mr. Ovie, meanwhile, stood to the side, smiling faintly, his arms crossed over his chest. "Uncle Femi, you won't find anything," he said calmly. "And how do you know that?" Uncle Femi shot back, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. Mr. Ovie's rise to prominence wasn't a product of mere hard work or divine favor, at least, not the kind of divine favor most people believed in. His path to wealth and power had always been shrouded in mystery, and few had ever dared to question the depth of his success. But as I would later come to understand, his rise was steeped in something far darker than anyone could have imagined. It started in a dimly lit room, far from the celebratory noise of the parties he would soon be attending. Mr. Ovie had long been a figure in the neighborhood, a well-dressed, boisterous man who commanded attention wherever he went. He'd earned respect, but not the kind that was born of honest work or genuine relationships. Mr. Ovie had become the toast of every gathering, not by chance, but by design. When Mr. Ovie was initiated into his cult, he was told that his success in society wasn't enough. The community loved him, yes, but to truly rise politically, to become untouchable, invincible, he needed something more, a way to renew his power continually, a way to keep his influence growing, especially when time seemed to stagnate. The leaders of the cult had given him an offer that seemed strange at first. They told him that the snakes, the venomous, powerful creatures he'd learned to control, held the secret to true power. Snakes had always been a symbol of transformation, danger, and rebirth, and the cult believed that by invoking them during public gatherings, especially at parties, they could take something from the people present, something they could use to maintain their relevance. This something was far more than just wealth or influence, it was the very essence of people's destinies. At first, Mr. Ovie resisted. The idea of using snakes in such a manner felt foreign to him, even though he'd always been comfortable with the creatures. But over time, as he began to witness how the cult's powers worked, his reluctance faded. The law of political power, the promise of continued success, was too great. And so, Mr. Ovie agreed. He was told to invoke the snakes during parties, when people were in their most vulnerable state, relaxed, eating, drinking, unaware of the world around them. The ritual began. Mr. Ovie would carefully place the snakes into the food spiritually in such a way that no one would see him. No one knew. The snakes, so well trained, would slither invisibly beneath the plates of rice, soup, and meat, into the steaming dishes of jollof rice and pepper soup. No one would ever suspect that what they were eating was far from ordinary. The snakes would move into the bodies of those eating, stealing their vitality, their dreams, and their destinies, absorbing what the cult needed to keep its power intact. He would watch the party unfold, laughing and chatting, pretending to be just another jubilant guest. But deep down, his mind was always on the snakes, silently shifting beneath the tables, working their magic. The people around him would be none the wiser, none of them aware that Mr. Ovie had just taken something valuable from them. Their success, their luck, their ambitions, they were all being transferred, just like that, into his own hands. It wasn't always obvious, of course. The people at the party wouldn't suddenly become ill or unwell. They might feel a slight drain afterward, a sense of emptiness they couldn't quite explain. Some of them might even feel their luck fading after such a gathering. But those who partook in Mr. Ovie's ritual would never truly understand why things were changing for them. Over the months and years, Mr. Ovie grew more powerful. Politicians, wealthy businessmen, and powerful community leaders all sought his favor, though none truly understood the source of his influence. They'd invite him to their events, desperate to have him in their corner, unknowingly feeding his dark ritual. He began to rise politically, a man who could sway elections with just a few words, who could orchestrate movements with the flick of his wrist. It was as if the universe itself had begun to bend to his will. But the more Mr. Ovie used the snakes, the more detached he became from the real world. His mind, once sharp and full of clever tricks, began to unravel. He had become so consumed by the ritual, so reliant on the power of the snakes, that he no longer cared about the people whose destinies he had stolen. He became obsessed with maintaining his relevance in society, with feeding the snakes, and with ensuring that no one ever discovered the truth behind his success. At the same time, the people whose destinies he had taken began to experience strange misfortunes. Some grew sick for no reason, others lost jobs or faced family problems they couldn't explain. It was as if their lives had been inexplicably altered in a way they couldn't control. But no one ever made the connection between the sudden bad luck and Mr. Ovie's presence at the parties. No one ever suspected the man who smiled so widely and gave so generously was secretly draining the life from their futures. Mr. Ovie's involvement in organizing parties for Gen Z was something many found unusual, given that he was much older than the young crowd he was catering to. His age, being decades apart from theirs, made his active participation in their events strange to the onlookers, but no one questioned it at first. Mr. Ovie had a secret purpose behind these gatherings. He had been instructed by his cult to interact with different age groups, but his primary focus was on the younger generation, the Gen Zs. The reason for this, as Mr. Ovie later learned, was that this age group held a certain kind of energy that was vital for the cult's rituals. The destinies of the young were believed to be malleable and full of potential, making them a prime source for the cult to harvest and manipulate for their own gain. He became a regular fixture at parties and events aimed at Gen Z. He would host large gatherings at his house, with music blaring and the youth enjoying the freedom of a carefree night. On the surface, it appeared like just another party thrown by an eccentric, older man who wanted to keep up with the trends. He would rent a flashy sound system, set up colorful lights, and invite influencers and the trendiest young people to the event. His house was always buzzing with energy, and it seemed like everyone was having the time of their lives. However, what most of the attendees didn't know was that Mr. Ovie's true mission at these parties went beyond just providing entertainment. As they danced and partied, Mr. Ovie had set up the space to invoke rituals, often through food. He would subtly slip poisonous substances into the dishes, as well as perform rites using snakes, slithering creatures he kept hidden under his long agbada. These rituals were part of a dark agenda, designed to steal the destinies of the young people present. He believed that the young souls had boundless potential, which he could channel into increasing his own power, wealth, and political influence. While the youth were distracted by the music and food, Mr. Ovie's cult members would quietly observe and ensure that the ritual had been carried out successfully. It was a well-rehearsed plan: feed, entertain, and subtly siphon away the destinies of the unwitting guests. As for Mr. Ovie, this strange combination of charm, wealth, and old-school rituals made him a figure of power in the community. He had convinced everyone around him that he was simply a man who loved to party, connecting with the younger crowd to keep his spirit young and vibrant. They didn't see the darker purpose behind his actions, nor did they understand that his seemingly innocent parties were all part of a greater, more sinister plan. The reason he focused so much on Gen Z was because they represented the future, an untapped well of potential. Mr. Ovie knew that the more destinies he collected, the more powerful he became, and the more influence he could wield over his community and even in politics. It was all a calculated game for him, and the events he threw were just a means to an end. Mr. Ovie's reach was far and wide, stretching beyond the usual gatherings of adults. He was a man who had a peculiar way of embedding himself into every part of the community, including the most innocent and unsuspecting ones, toddlers and the elderly. No one suspected the man in the sharply cut agbada, always smiling and with a hearty laugh, to be a person who would orchestrate such dark ceremonies at these vulnerable stages of life. It was around the time when toddlers started celebrating their first birthdays, and families would host grand parties to mark the occasion. Mr. Ovie knew how to blend into any environment. His presence at children's parties was nothing short of charming. He'd show up with gifts in hand, always offering the most extravagant presents, tricycles, toys, even expensive clothes for the little ones. He was the type of man who made people feel as though he had known them for years, always offering words of wisdom for new parents, advising them on raising their children, and making himself indispensable in the community. At these toddler parties, Mr. Ovie played the role of a trusted guest, someone everyone welcomed with open arms. Parents and relatives were often busy with food, music, and dancing, so it was easy to overlook him when he'd quietly slip away, his eyes scanning the room. Under the pretense of wanting to bless the children, Mr. Ovie would carefully orchestrate moments when the toddlers would be placed near food or toys, almost as though he was testing their innocence. It wasn't just about the toddlers. Mr. Ovie's ritualistic practices often involved creating an atmosphere where he could subtly manipulate the young, siphoning off their essence, something that took years to understand fully, but which, at the time, only felt like a strange, inexplicable unease. The toddlers, innocent and unaware, would often start acting out of character after these blessings, their energy drained, their personalities subdued in ways no child should be. The parents never suspected a thing. They were too focused on the celebrations, too caught up in the joy of seeing their children grow. They trusted Mr. Ovie, perhaps more than they trusted anyone. But there were murmurs, small signs that something wasn't quite right. Some children seemed to grow more lethargic after Mr. Ovie's visits. Others would complain of bad dreams, or worse, start developing inexplicable illnesses. But no one ever put the pieces together. And then there were the elderly. Mr. Ovie had a peculiar habit of visiting old age homes, often organizing elaborate parties for senior citizens, much to their delight. He would bring food, music, and sometimes even performers, turning the usually quiet, somber homes into vibrant, joyful places. The elderly residents, who had long been neglected by society, welcomed him with open arms. After all, who wouldn't appreciate a party when you've spent most of your life being forgotten? However, as with the toddler parties, Mr. Ovie's presence at these gatherings was more than just about the food and fun. His true intentions lay hidden beneath his generous facade. His belief was that the elderly held within them the untapped power of their past, years of life experience, knowledge, and, more significantly, destinies that could be manipulated. Mr. Ovie's ritual was to extract this power, to draw from their spirits and their life force. At the parties he organized, there would be moments when the elderly, who were often caught up in the excitement, would unknowingly let down their guard. They would sit back in their chairs, laughing with others, distracted by the music and festivities. Mr. Ovie would move around them, slipping his hands into the bowls of food or gently brushing his fingers across the back of their necks. It wasn't physical contact in the usual sense, it was as though his touch was a conduit for something darker, something invisible but powerful. Over time, the elderly people would begin to change. Some would become withdrawn, as if their life energy had been drained. Others would suffer from strange illnesses that no doctor could explain. Their once bright personalities became dull and faded, and they seemed to lose the spark that had once made them vibrant. The joy and peace they once had would slowly be replaced by confusion and fear, as if they were losing themselves bit by bit. The workers at the homes began to notice the patterns, but like everyone else, they were too afraid to confront the truth. Mr. Ovie's reputation had grown so strong, so revered, that his presence at these homes had almost become a regular tradition. His ability to charm his way into the lives of those most vulnerable gave him an unfathomable level of power. And the more people he managed to influence, the more powerful he became. He wasn't just taking destinies from toddlers and the elderly, he was building an empire on stolen lives. The people who attended didn't realize they were nothing more than pawns in his ritualistic schemes. That is, until Annie, the young girl, saw the truth. Her eyes, wide with terror, had seen something no adult could, no one except the cult members themselves, could ever know. Annie saw the snake moving from the food on the table into Mr. Ovie's body. It was a simple, horrifying truth, one that no one else at the party could see, and it haunted her. When she spoke of what she had witnessed, no one believed her, of course. The adults dismissed her as a child with an overactive imagination. They all thought she was simply mistaken, or perhaps playing a prank. Mr. Ovie, ever the charming man, laughed it off, convincing everyone that the little girl was just making things up. But deep down, I knew she wasn't. There was something unsettling about Mr. Ovie, something I couldn't shake after that day. He had always been a figure of mystery, but now I saw him for what he truly was, a man who had sold his soul for power, using others as pawns in his dark, unholy game. No one could stop him. No one had the power to do so, not without risking their own lives, their own destinies. The snakes had him in their grip, and he would continue to use them, continue to feed on the lives of those who trusted him, until the day he was finally brought to justice. But that day, I fear, will not come anytime soon. For weeks after the party, strange things began to happen. People who attended started falling sick, headaches, weakness, a sense of heaviness they couldn't explain. It's just the weather, they said, but I wasn't so sure. My sister was one of them. She came home from the party complaining of fatigue and aches. At first, I thought it was nothing, but then her behavior changed. She stopped praying, stopped cooking, stopped doing the things she loved. She spent most of her days lying down, staring at nothing. Maybe it's spiritual, one of her friends suggested. "You should go to church for deliverance." I couldn't let it go. I started paying closer attention to Mr. Ovie, watching him at every event. That's when I noticed the pattern. Wherever he went, people fell ill. Businesses failed. Families broke apart. One night, I followed him. He left the party early and headed toward an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. I stayed hidden, peeking through a crack in the door. Inside, he knelt before a makeshift altar, chanting in a low, guttural voice. Snakes, dozens of them, slithered out from the shadows, their eyes glowing in the dim light. "They belong to me now," he said, his voice echoing. "Their destinies are mine." I ran home, my heart pounding. The next day, I went to Sister Damalola. "Your daughter saw something," I told her. She nodded solemnly. "She's been having nightmares ever since that party. She says the man with the agbada is trying to take people's lives." Together, we went to Pastor Ode. When we explained what had happened, his face darkened. "This is not ordinary," he said. "We must pray." That night, the church gathered for a vigil. We prayed fervently, calling on God to expose the evil in our midst. The air was thick with tension, and as the prayers grew louder, I felt a strange heaviness lift from my chest. The next time I saw Mr. Ovie, he was different. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. People had started talking, whispers about the strange things happening around him. One day, he vanished. His house was found empty, his belongings gone. Some said he'd fled to another town, others said he'd been taken by the very spirits he served. But the sicknesses stopped. The heaviness lifted. And Annie, the little girl who had seen it all, finally slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. But no matter the reason for his disappearance, one thing was certain: the sicknesses stopped. The heaviness that had hung over our community for so long lifted, like the morning fog dissipating under the warmth of the sun. People who had been struggling with inexplicable ailments began to recover. Families who had been tormented by bad luck and fear found peace again. And Annie, the little girl who had seen it all, finally slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The nightmares that had once haunted her faded away, replaced by a calm and restful sleep. We knew that our prayers had been heard, that God had exposed the evil in our midst and had protected us from harm. The story of Mr. Ovie served as a reminder of the power of faith, the importance of prayer, and the victory of light over darkness. Though the events had shaken us all, they also drew us closer together as a community, united in our belief that no evil could stand against the power of God. But as the days passed, questions remained. Where had Mr. Ovie gone? Had he truly fled, or had something more sinister claimed him? And most troubling of all, would his evil work ever truly be finished? Had he left behind others who would carry on his dark rituals? Was this the end, or just the beginning of something far more dangerous? For now, though, the peace we'd regained was enough. But I couldn't shake the feeling that our fight against evil wasn't over. We had won this battle, but the war, was it still raging on in the shadows? Let me know your thoughts below. What do you think happened to Mr. Ovie? Do you think his evil could come back? Share your thoughts, and if you've ever seen anything like this, or know someone who attends parties with strange things happening, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and share if you learned something from this story. Part 2 coming soon.